You may remember that, well, I hope you remember, that thousands of years earlier, there was a Shramana movement as a response to the situation at the time. And so, just before the Mughal invasion of India, in the early 1500s, Guru Nanak, as he came to be called, Guru Nanak, I suppose you could say founded a new religion, although if you look at some of his teachings, it seems like he didn't want to found just another religion, but it seems like that's what happened. So there's two very interesting things about Sikh history, which we're going to be talking about. One is we have another attempt, which turns out to be not so practical, to divest religion of rituals, hierarchy, and so you have a figure, Guru Nanak, and then all the rituals and hierarchy come back. You remember Buddhism, same thing, like it's going to be very simple and spiritual, without hierarchy, without rituals, but all that stuff comes back. Same thing in Jainism, and same thing in Sikhism. So I'll just talk a little bit about the historical context. Historical context is that there was tension in India. There was, of course, the Hindu majority. There was a Muslim minority which still held political power. Just like in Iraq, you had a Sunni minority that held political power with Saddam Hussein, and you had a Shiite majority. So when you have a minority of people with political and military power, it creates some tension. Excuse me. So also within Hinduism and, oh my God, call back the trucks, the rescue trucks. Anyway, within Hinduism and within Islam, there was tremendous diversity. There were sort of born-again fundamentalist, literalist fanatics within Islam, and there were Sufis who were quite liberal, cosmopolitan, spiritual, mystic, universalist. In Hinduism, you had all kinds of things going on. The bhakti movements, the ritualistic Brahmins, all kinds of things were going on. But there's still, I mean, there was a sense in which Hindus were Hindus and Muslims were Muslims, and there was some tension there. And there was a movement, I don't know if you call it a movement, but there was a cultural force or a cultural trend. Certain people like the poet Kabir and another poet Ravi Das and others who were basically saying, hey, why is everybody fighting over religion? Like, forget all these doctrines, forget all these rituals and everything. There's only one God. And so that was all going on at the time of Guru Nanak, who basically is a contemporary of Martin Luther. Guru Nanak was born in 1469 and passed away in 1539. And Luther is, roughly about that period. And also you have Sri Chaitanya, we're going to be talking about, who started the Krishna movement, which is all Indian now around the world. And he was born in 1486, and I think it was 1533 or 34 around it. And then Luther. So around the world, this is like 2,500 years ago, you have Confucius and Buddha and all kinds of people on earth. So there are certain periods in history when a lot goes on, and so this is one of those periods. The Protestant Reformation completely transformed Europe, transformed Western civilization, and ultimately, well, it changed everything. So this is the same time, by the way, that you have this tremendous explosion of globalization, which didn't start in your lifetime, with Christopher Columbus. Colon, I guess this is, whatever they call it, Colombo, I think is his Italian name, his real name. But anyway, so Columbus, when he discovered, well, he was trying to get to India, but he didn't. So, but it opened up a whole new part of the world. So people were discovering the world, Vasco da Gama, going around Africa and actually getting to India, and the printing press and travel journals. So the world was exploding. There was this incredible globalization. There was an explosion of new technology in navigation, military technology, Again, the printing press. I mean, the world was being radically transformed. Just as when you live, I mean, today you have a sense the world is changing very quickly, and sometimes people have trouble keeping up with it. So back then also, globalization really exploded back then during this period that we're talking about. We've got a big show and tell coming in. So my God. So what's interesting is that people like Kabir, the poet Ravi Das, people like, to some extent, Guru Nanak, they made a certain assumption. They made a certain assumption, which is very interesting. Actually, it's the same assumption that, as we'll, if the world still exists in a few weeks and we talk about modern Hinduism, we'll talk about that again. In figures like Dr. Radhakrishnan and Vivekananda and so on. And there's this typical assumption that tends to be made as follows. That, look, there's all these different religions, and they tend to fight with each other, they're in conflict, and yet there's only one God. And if there's something like a soul, it's like everybody's basically the same kind of soul. And so therefore the problem is, in a sense, the problem is that all these sectarian religions, in quotes, are too specific. If you just say God, if you just say I believe in God and you believe in God, it's like there's no problem. But if I say I believe in Rama and you believe in Allah, we start using specific names and attributing specific qualities, details, the devil's in the details. The more specific we get about religion, the more we're going to disagree. The more we're going to disagree. So it's like if we say, what do you want to do today? I don't know, what do you want to do? Hey, why don't we go out to the country? God, anyway, I won't get into my West Coast bias. I mean, I'm in the country in Florida. So anyway, let's say a bunch of people agree, let's go out to the country. So at that point they agree, but someone says, I want to go to the ocean. No, I want to go to a lake and wrestle an alligator. Or I want to go to the forest, or I want to go to the springs, or I just want to, find some trip. So as soon as you start to get specific, people disagree. But as long as you keep it very general, everyone can agree, yeah, let's get out of the city. So in the same way, I read a quote from Kabir who said that God's not in the mandir, Hindu temple, or the mosque, or I suppose he would have said the synagogue and the church, but God is not in those places. He's not in the specific pilgrimages, because pilgrimages are to specific holy places. God is just in your heart, or God is just there. God is everywhere. So basically knock off all the specificity. Get rid of all the details. Keep it very general, very spiritual, and everybody can agree and have a good time. So you find this in Kabir and Ravi Das, and so you don't want God to be personal, because if God is personal, people tend to be specific people. Like you're a person, you're a person, and you have a particular face and a particular personality and body, and you like certain things and you don't like other things, and you hang out in certain places and avoid other places, and like certain kinds of music, and so on and so forth, and do the monster mash. So the idea is that it's the nature of people, they chronically tend to do specific things. And so if you say God is a person, you start to imagine, so it goes. I'm not saying it really is imagination, but so it goes. You start to imagine all kinds of details about the nature of God. Actually, there was a debate like this within Islam, a very famous theological debate among people who study theological debates in Islam. Around 1,000 years ago, in the great court of Baghdad, the court that brought us things like the Arabian Nights and all that stuff. So, Baghdad at its height, this big cosmopolitan city, center of an empire. So, in Baghdad, there were some court priests or theologians, intellectuals called the Mu'tazila. And they were really into Aristotle. They thought Aristotle is totally groovy. So it's just like, remember Augustine, the great philosopher, Christian philosopher of late antiquity and the most influential Christian philosopher of the Middle Ages. He was into Plato. So the Mutazila got very rational, because they weren't even in Plato, it was worse. They were into Aristotle. So they got very rational and very logical. And they started to look at the Quran. And they started to think, hey, there's all these anthropomorphic descriptions in the Quran, such as God sits as a great king on his throne. God extends his hand in judgment. All these, for them, as sort of sophisticated intellectuals and academics, embarrassingly anthropomorphic statements. So they concluded that these statements are just poetic and imaginary. They are ways of encouraging pre-philosophical boobs. Pre-philosophical people to be religious. Because when you become sort of an intellectual heavyweight, when you're really intellectual and you've been to college and everything, you don't mess around with childish anthropomorphism. You go beyond that. But the great unwashed, the mass of people who aren't so bright, they need these descriptions. They need these personal, humanistic descriptions. Anyway, this led to a big philosophical melee, kind of a rumble in the Islamic world. And some great Islamic philosophers rushed to defend the literal sense of the Quran and say, no, these things should be taken seriously, that God really is personal, and so on. You find the same debate going on in the Jewish intellectual world, roughly the same time. There was a famous Jewish theologian, philosopher in Spain, because Spain under the Moors was actually a center of Jewish intellectuality and culture. And after La Reconquista, after the Spanish Catholics took over Spain again and kicked out the Muslims, then things got much better, much more civilized and cultured, and you had the Inquisitions and, torturing and killing lots of people. So, thank God the good guys took over Spain. Anyway, so Maimonides in Spain also was thought that these personal descriptions of God are sort of pre-philosophical, pre-rational, and anthropomorphic. And you have, around the same time, Meister Eckhart in Christianity, sort of a Christian mystic who was sort of the Shankara of medieval Christianity. That, again, it's all one in a sense, and God's not really a person. So this is a historical pattern. That you get people who think they are, quote-unquote, intellectual and rational, and they look at these very personal descriptions of God and think, I don't think so. These things are too specific. God is universal, and so on. And then there are philosophers in all these traditions, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu. There are serious, actually sophisticated philosophers in all these traditions that defend the personal nature of God, even the idea that God has a personal form. There's one famous mystic in Christianity, St. John of the Cross, who taught what is called in Christian theology bridal mysticism, an idea very similar to what you find in Vaishnavism in India. The idea that you can become the bride of God, that in the act of surrendering to God and loving God, there's a type of mystic relationship with God where one becomes like the bride of God, becomes sort of a romantic relationship with God. And you find this other places also. There are people who disagreed with Maimonides. There were people, Jewish mystics and philosophers, that talked about the spiritual body of God. And there are meditations. There are medieval meditations on the mystic spiritual body of Jesus, put to music, actually, by Buxtehude, a great Baroque composer who, among his fans, were Bach and Handel. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is this is just religion. This is not just India. This is just human religion. That there's this battle, there's this tension. And of course in India it played out in Vedanta. You had Shankara saying that ultimately God is not a person with a personal form, although he's a closet Vaishnava and writes these beautiful poems devoting himself to Krishna and worshiping Krishna as a person. So Shankara is kind of bi-theological. But then again, his followers get sort of very rigorously impersonal. And then Ramanuja, the great Ramanuja, from Southeast India. He leads the charge defending, in an extremely sophisticated way, philosophically, intellectually, defending the idea that God is a person. God has a body, a spiritual body. So this is one of the great divides, one of the great debates in the history of human religion. We can talk about it in India, or you can talk about it in any religion. It's just, it happens. So, it's happening again now in the 15th and 16th century. You have people like Kabir, Ravidas, and to some extent, not so aggressively, Guru Nanak, who look at this tension between Hindus and Muslims and they say, hey, this is nonsense. There's only one God. We're all souls. It's like, what's the problem? The problem is you guys are too specific. You are over-specifying God, and you keep it more general, more universal. No one's going to disagree. Which is, it's very good, let's say, as a diplomatic move, but is a good philosophy because it sort of rules out. So when Kabir says God is not in the mosque, God is not in the mandir, I mean, is that actually true? I mean, what about the trillions of people, or large numbers of people? What about all the people that go to churches and mosques and mandirs and synagogues and Buddhist shrines and really have spiritual experiences, have very powerful spiritual experiences, they claim, and who swear for their whole lives that I really found God. And when I go there, it gives me a tremendous spiritual boost. I very intensely feel God's presence. Or, for example, among other things rejected, like pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is kind of for squares. Like, like really spiritual people don't go on pilgrimage. So the idea is in Hinduism that God came down, the avatar, and you can go to places like Vrindavan or Mathura, where Krishna was born, or Ayodhya, where Ram was born. Or you can go to the shrines of saints. You can go to Dwarka. I mean, all kinds of places. Places where Shiva or Shakti, maybe where Shakti, threw part of her anatomy down or something. So the idea, yes?
I was just wondering, why does it matter? These people that, so if what they're saying is true, if God isn't personal and God is everywhere and he's not in these specific places, does it matter that these other people think that as long as they still live the way they're supposed to live?
I mean, people who believe in a personal God.
Yeah.
I guess these people felt that it was the devotion to a personal, specific God that was causing conflict because, for example, Muslims came and said, well, Allah isn't wrong. And, or some people, it's an interesting point because actually, until the Muslim invasion of India, I think you could argue cogently that for the most part, for almost all the parts, for the most part, people in India, even though they disagreed on details like is God Ram or Krishna or Shiva or Shakti, they weren't really killing each other over it, and people were kind of living in peace. And even Buddha, for example, ended up as an incarnation of Vishnu, and everybody's happy. So when it was really the tension was, I think, undoubtedly, the tension, the interreligious tension was severely ratcheted up when you had this Middle Eastern way of looking at things. And of course, when the Christians come, it's the European Christians come, it's just more of the same. In the sense that, we have the living God, you worship dead gods, this is the true religion, you have a false religion. And this is in a society which for thousands of years, going back to the Rig Veda, said, well, yeah, I'm worshiping a real divine being, and so are you. We may disagree on which one is the ultimate, but we both respect each other's object of worship. So you have an inclusive, assimilating civilization, and suddenly you get these actually two waves of Middle Eastern dogmatism saying that, this is the right way and everything else is horrible and evil and great things like eternal hell. So, yeah, so it did change the atmosphere. It did change the atmosphere. Yes?
Was Sikhism anything like Baha'i?
Baha'i, I think, was another response, another attempt to transcend religious conflict through universalism.
We always talk about, it's all the religions, it's all Baha'i. That kind of seems like Sikhism's going at.
Yeah.
All the same thing.
Well, we're going to talk a little more about Sikhism. We'll get talk a little more about it. One thing I wanted to mention about Sikhism is that, did you have a point?
Yeah. What was this debate? Is the recurring theme is rationalists versus literalists?
Well, in religious scriptures, especially the theistic ones, like those who accept a God, there tend to be specific descriptions of God. Even, you could say, descriptions of texts that depict God as being very personal, even human-like. Like the Bible saying we're made in the image of God. Or that God is always compared to a king in the Abrahamic traditions and so on. And so then you get this rational tendency to deny all that and say that's just anthropomorphism. And then there are very philosophically sophisticated replies saying that no, that God has a spiritual body, that these things are not just pre-philosophical, they're actually the real understanding, and we are made in the image of God. So those debates go on in every tradition. Now, there are two issues I wanted to focus on in the history of Sikhism. One is this initial attempt to do away with things like pilgrimage and rituals and hierarchy, and they all come roaring back. In fact, Sikhism, you see this real shift because Guru Nanak, at a certain point, I think in his early 30s, he goes into a river like he does every morning because they didn't have, in India it's sort of a tropical country and they got rivers everywhere, so you just go take a bath in the river. And one morning he went to take a bath in the river and he apparently had some really powerful experience and didn't show up for about 3 days. And when he came back after 3 days, he was an inspired man that had a message to teach the world. And I mean, think about Muhammad, for example, going off into the hills and coming back as a very inspired man, or as a prophet. So the message was, I mean, basically that we don't need to fight over religion, and that there's one God, and that one God is in everyone, and sort of like this simple spirituality. And Guru Nanak he was born to Hindu parents. He's born to Hindu parents, and he travels. He goes to Baghdad, he goes to Mecca, he travels around India teaching his message, and what he teaches is that you can keep your religion. Hindus can be Hindus, Muslims can be Muslims, but here's a platform on which everyone can unite. Here's a universal platform. And he has followers who are Hindus and Muslims and kind of continue to be Hindus and Muslims. I mean, think back to Jesus, where the early followers of Jesus continued to be Jews. In fact, James, the brother of Jesus, was a practicing Orthodox Jew that went to the synagogue, temple in Jerusalem every day. And then you have Paul saying, hey, look everybody, if you really believe in Jesus, then why are you still practicing Judaism? And then Paul wants to make a new religion. But the early followers of Jesus think, yeah, we're Jews, but Jesus is the greatest Jewish prophet. Similarly, you have followers of Guru Nanak who continue to be Muslims and Hindus, but then, just as the followers of Jesus gradually broke away, especially Paul was pushing this, and say, no, actually we're a different religion. And that's exactly what happened with Sikhism. Something which was meant to be sort of like an antidote to sectarian religion, that here's an alternative to sectarian religion, and it ends up becoming, I would say, one of the world religions most closely identified with a particular geographic area and ethnic tradition. In fact, in this little book which we used last semester, but I didn't want to make everyone buy it again because we only spent 2 days on this, Sikhism, it's mentioned that sort of contemporary field work, anthropological, sociological research in England, where of course there are large Sikh communities in certain specific areas in England have sort of concentrated Sikh populations, that when they interview Sikh youth about their identity, about how they see themselves, they found that these young Sikhs would sort of interchangeably identify themselves as Sikhs and Punjabis. And so to be Punjabi is to be Sikh, and to be Sikh is to be Punjabi. And so you have this extremely, almost inseparable connection between a geographic area, an ethnic tradition, a particular political history, and a religion. And this is a tradition which started out as rejecting the idea of specific sort of sectarian religions, and there's no need to form religions and do rituals and all that. We can just love God, with emphasis on chanting the name of God. Chaitanya, who's a contemporary. What did I do with Chaitanya? Anyway, Chaitanya, who's a contemporary of Guru Nanak, he, of course, is famous for teaching and chanting of the names of God, specifically Hare Krishna. And so you have Guru Nanak, a contemporary, teaching basically the same thing, that just chant the names of God. But again, so what happened? How did this tradition, with this apparently, very sincere teacher, Guru Nanak, who travels around, he's a big traveler, goes everywhere, attracts Muslim and Hindu followers, tells them, you can keep your own religion, you don't have to change your religion, just be spiritual and don't get involved in all these rituals, and you don't need to do all that stuff, and you don't need books, you don't need to depend on scriptures. And yet the Sikh religion becomes the religion of all the world religions, probably the one that most worships, real physical worship, like everything involved in Hindu puja, where you put something on an altar and you ring a bell and offer an incense stick and offer a lamp, with ghee wicks, and offer water and flowers. All the physical paraphernalia and procedures of puja, ritualistic puja, is offered to the book. They end up with their own scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib, which they take to be the Guru. Guru Nanak's the first Guru, or Acharya, the first great teacher. There are 9 more, so they have 10 Gurus, this succession. After the 10th Guru, no more Gurus, and now the Guru becomes the book. And they actually treat the book as a deity, like when they transport it, let's say, from India to Canada, where there's a lot of Sikhs. They actually buy a seat for it, and they fan it. They fan the book. They, in every way, treat the book as a person, as a living, breathing, holy person, as a divine person. And yet, this is a tradition which began by saying that people shouldn't take books too seriously. So what happened? I'm not trying, and I don't mean to say that Sikhism betrayed its founder. I'm not trying to make that point. I'm simply saying there was a remarkable evolution. And so what is actually the history? How did all this happen? And basically, I think what happened is, and I'll go over some of the details, if there are no, whoops, well, maybe we'll finish it on Friday if you don't have any further emergencies. I think you can trace 2 things that happened, 2 extremely significant events that were kind of like catalysts or triggers that really transformed the Sikh community. One was simply that Guru Nanak stopped traveling and settled down. Now, if you study the history of nomadic and semi-nomadic cultures as opposed to settled civilizations, if you study, for example, the tension between the settled populations of Baghdad and other great Muslim cities and the semi-nomadic, the nomadic people who traveled around, there's always this tension. Because, it's simple. It's like Sociology 1A. It's Marxism 1A. That when you have a bunch of people who are traveling around, they have a different kind of culture, different political structures, more egalitarian, different kinds of divisions of labor, more like everybody does everything. If you study the history of, let's say, the wandering Hebrew tribes that came out of Egypt, and just look at their sociology, their political structures, and then what happened when they came to Palestine, they settled, they became a nation, and it totally transformed their political and social structures. So when you live somewhere, when you settle down, life becomes very different than when you're on the road. It's just a very different life. The exact same thing happened, by the way, in Buddhism. There's a significant event that took place when Buddhist monks stopped traveling and started founding monasteries. You start to get divisions of labor, you start to get more sophisticated culture, you start to get hierarchies, you start to get all kinds of things, specializations. The same thing happened in the Franciscan movement, when the Catholics. Francis just sort of wandered around, slept naked under the stars, and died young, actually, because of that, because he didn't take care of his body so much. But then his followers, they wanted to build monasteries. They're like, they'd had enough of this back to nature movement. And so there was a conflict even between Francis and his own followers during his life. He was actually removed from the Franciscan order, very politely, during his life, over issues like that. So when Guru Nanak's traveling, he's just on the road. I mean, when you're on the road, you can't build big buildings. There's no need for hierarchy because you're just on the road. And you're meeting all kinds of people, and you can't have that many followers because you're on the road. And, and he goes to Mecca and to Baghdad, and wherever he goes, he's, trying to sort of present his message in a way that will appeal to people there. I mean, even look at Paul. When Paul's in Athens, he tries to sound real philosophical because he's in Athens. It's interesting. You can actually, he even says that, well, I'm in Athens now, so I'm going to really be philosophical here. And so, anyway, so Guru Nanak at a certain point stops traveling and settles down. He got married. He had 2 kids. And when he settles down, because he was obviously a very attractive figure, lots of people start gathering around him. And when you have lots of people, you got to organize. It's like, okay, who's in charge here? And I thought you were supposed to cook. No, I thought Fred was supposed to cook. Okay, who's going to be in charge of cooking? Yeah, that's real world stuff. That's the real world. You can't avoid it no matter what your philosophy is. So you start getting these hierarchies, and it starts to look like a religion. It's not supposed to be a religion. It's like the problem is all these sectarian religions, and this is the solution, just be universal and spiritual. But then, when Guru Nanak stops traveling, it starts to look like a religion, like all the other ones. And they start to have hierarchies and ceremonies, and that's the nature of settled life. Now, that was one big, as a historian, looking at the history of Sikhism as a historian, I think that was a very significant thing when Guru Nanak stopped traveling. And you start to develop a society. And another big thing, a real crossroads, when the Sikh community really had to make a choice. And that is, I think it was the third or fourth, maybe the fourth Guru, Arjan. Isn't that his name? Anyone here expert in all that? Yeah, Guru Arjan Dev, who built the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Now, when Babar, the Mughal, invaded and defeated the Delhi Sultanate throughout all these sort of dynasties, these affiliated dynasties that ruled a lot of India, and established the Mughal rule, Guru Nanak thought this was a great thing because apparently there was some cultural difference between the Mughals and the previous dynasties that he thought this is good for India. This is a good thing. So Guru Nanak welcomed this change. But what happened is, by the time you get down to, and then Humayun, right? His son Humayun was also kind of a nice guy and had good relations with the Sikhs because the Sikhs were kind of positive about Mughal rule. But then what happens is, by the time you get down to, then you get Akbar. And Akbar even goes up to Punjab and takes part in what they call the langar, where they have these group meals. Plato also recommends that people should have group meals to really tie a community together. That's a big thing in Sikhism, where everybody sits down and eats together. So Akbar comes and takes part. Akbar, the great eclectic, totally into world religions. He would have majored probably in world religions if he was at UF, as an exchange student. Anyway, so Akbar has this really great relationship with the Sikhs. Everything's really happy. Then, when Akbar dies, his son Jahangir does not peacefully take the throne. He basically murders all the contenders. It's like a political campaign where you kill all the other candidates and then you win. So Jahangir, after Akbar, in a sense, in the Mughal political culture, there's sort of a new situation, and that is it gets into really out of control, murderous competition for the throne. And the Sikhs kind of get caught in the middle of this, because Jahangir is, in his efforts to kill all his brothers and anyone else who challenges him for the throne, one of his relatives, I don't think a brother, I think it was actually a nephew or something, but anyway, one of his relatives fled the capital and went up to the Punjab, because precisely because he knew that the Sikhs have a good relation with the Mughals. So he goes up there, this young guy, and begs for help and protection, like, they're on my tail. Can you hide me? I need a little money because I gotta need a little money to build an army, and I gotta get out of town, and so on. And so this Guru Arjan Dev, who's actually the fifth guru, Guru Nanak being the first, he, for whatever reason, whether it's political or just trying to be a nice guy, for whatever reason, he helps this person. He helps this person get away and gives him some money. Now, Jahangir thought that was really the wrong thing to do. And so Jahangir eventually, I think, gets the guy, and he wants revenge. He's really unhappy with the Sikhs, because the Sikhs, he feels, kind of meddled in Mughal family political affairs. And so, to make a long story short, Guru Arjan Dev is tortured and killed. He's a fifth guru. Now, at that point, the Sikh community has to make a choice. I think I see this in terms of history, as being the real turning point. Because at that point, they have two options, really. One is, okay, it was a mistake to get involved in Mughal wars of succession. That was a big mistake. Let's never do that again. Let's just go back to the kind of life that Guru Nanak had. No politics at all. Let's just talk about God and sing the name of God and just, we've learned a lesson. That's it. We'll never again get involved in this kind of politics. That's not the choice they made. The other choice was, we have to totally militarize. We've got to get even. This is war. And that was the choice they made. So, by the time they made this choice, and that of course totally transformed the Sikh community, it became the Khalsa. The Khalsa means basically the community of the faithful. And this one word doesn't mean all that, but that's what the word indicates. It's the community of the faithful who are bound together in their sacred beliefs and culture, and in their political military solidarity in the service of their sacred tradition. And Sikhs start wearing daggers. Like, one of the things you do if you're a Sikh is, if you're a male Sikh, you wear a knife, which they still do. So, of course, it's, go through airport security lines, you have to be a little flexible, but still, because by this time, now the Punjabi people are, if you know the Punjab, they tend to be big, strong people. They're not wimps. And by the time of the fifth guru, they were, Sikhism had really become like a national religion. It wasn't just a community of sages, and there was, even though you can still be a Hindu or a Muslim, but really it become its own religion, and it become more and more identified with that particular region, the Punjab, and with certain ethnic traditions, because India, if you really want to understand India in a sense, you have to think Europe. It's just like Europe is Europe. It's one culture area, and there's a sense in which Europeans are Europeans, but Portuguese and Slovakians and Norwegians and Sicilians have, very different cultures. Not to speak of Andorrans and Luxembourgians. So, in the same way, India is as big and as diverse as Europe. At least in Europe, everyone, if you go to Russia or the Slavic countries, you tend to have even a different script. In India, you go from state to state. You go from Gujarat to the Punjab, to Maharashtra, to Tamil Nadu, to Andhra Pradesh, wherever. They have a different alphabet in every state. They actually have a different alphabet. They have a different language. They have their own cuisine, their own marriage rituals, ways of dress. They're different countries. Now, the English came and kind of forced it together as a country, and it has a history at times. Other great powers put it together, and it is just like Europe. If you look at Europe, oh my God, a minute over. Okay, last sentence. Europe, at times, became larger empires at times, dissolved. But so we'll finish the Sikh thing next time. Sorry for the extra minute. But you owe me several minutes, but we have it early next time.